Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlaw Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlaw Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Welcome to this edition of Access to Democracy. I'm your guest host, Steve Francisco, and it's my pleasure to welcome our guest today, Ken Martin, who is the chair of the Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party. Welcome to Access to Democracy, Ken.
Thanks, Steve. It's great to be here.
Glad to have you here. Looking back to election night, November 6, 2012, some of the headlines. President Obama easily defeats his Republican opponent Mitt Romney in Minnesota 52 to 45%. Senator Amy Klobuchar defeats her Republican opponent Kurt Bills by a 2-to-1 margin, 65 to 30%. Former Congressman Rick Nolan goes back to Congress after, I think, about 30 years absence and claims the seat of Congressman Chip Kravac in northeastern Minnesota. The DFL wins control of both the Minnesota House and the Minnesota Senate, reversing Republicans' takeover of both of those chambers in 2010. And two state constitutional amendments that the DFL had strongly opposed, defining marriage or limiting marriage to one man and one woman, and a second that would have required photo identification to be able to vote in Minnesota. Both of those amendments defeated. How did this happen?
Well, you know, obviously, there's an old saying in politics that victory has 1,000 fathers and defeat is an orphan. And in this case, it truly is the case that there were many different factors that went into this election. No one organization or person can claim credit for what happened here in this state. It was really a perfect storm in so many ways of things that came together to allow us to have one of our most historic wins in our DFL party history. Now we are at the apex of political power for our party. We've never been more powerful politically. When you dig deeper into the election results, we were the only state in the country to actually flip both chambers of the legislature. We were the first state in the country, as you mentioned, to beat back a gay marriage amendment, and the first state in the country to beat back a voter ID amendment. We feel really good about sending Congressman Nolan back to Congress in the 8th District. We took that back. Now we control 7 of the 10 congressional offices are in DFL hands.
And all of the top state constitutional offices are occupied by DFLers.
Correct. Every statewide office, both the U.S. senators and all the constitutional officers, are controlled by DFLers. And then, of course, it's the first time in 22 years now that we've had a DFL governor and majorities in both the state House and state Senate. So it was truly one of the most historic elections, certainly of my lifetime, but clearly for the DFL party as well.
Let me ask you this, Ken. There had to be a few surprises in this election. I mean, it's obviously a very broad victory for the DFL from the bottom of the ticket to the top. What one or two surprises stand out to you about this election?
You know, I think it wasn't a surprise. We knew probably a week to 2 weeks out that we were headed in this direction, but there was really a lot of uncertainty as to whether or not we would take back both chambers of the legislature. And somewhere around August or so, it became pretty apparent based on polling and other anecdotal information from the field that we were receiving that we were going to take back the state Senate. and even Republicans were quietly conceding that point to us. So the real battle in those final few months came to the House and whether or not we could take back the state House representatives. There was, as you know, a number of seats in play throughout the state, which made it difficult to predict whether or not we would indeed take back the state House. But in the end, in the final days as we headed into that election, it became apparent based on our own polling and again what we were seeing in the field in terms of enthusiasm and turnout at that point that we were going to take back the state House as well. One of the benchmarks we used, not too surprisingly, was how well President Obama did in the state. And we knew if President Obama performed better than 5 percentage points in Minnesota that we had an excellent shot at taking back both legislative chambers.
So do you think that the Romney campaign was bluffing when at the very last weekend before the campaign they sent their vice presidential candidate Paul Ryan? There was some discussion in the media that perhaps Governor Romney had a chance to become the first Republican presidential candidate to win Minnesota since Richard Nixon in 1972.
Well, I've always contended that the play in Minnesota was not for Minnesota itself, but really because our media markets bleed both into Wisconsin and Iowa, what the Republican campaign was trying to do and Romney's campaign was really trying to put western Wisconsin and northern Iowa into play for the campaign, and that the the side benefit would be to potentially put Minnesota into play. And in those final few days, you remember the Star Tribune and a few other media outlets here in the state showed a pretty close race. Reality is our own internal polling showed the president up throughout. He never even came close to losing his lead here. And the last tracking poll that we did a week before the election had him up 7 points. So we knew that the president was going to win. The final margin, we didn't quite know what that would be, but we had a lot of degree of confidence that that his candidacy was going to have coattails for our legislative candidates.
Let's turn to the congressional races for just a second, too. Particularly, I don't think many people were surprised that Amy Klobuchar won a rather resounding victory, to say the least. But in the House races, we saw a first-time candidate, Jim Graves, come within 1.2%, I believe it was, of actually winning Michelle Bachmann's seat in the 6th District. Was that surprising to you that he did that well?
That was a surprise, and 4,000 votes I think was the final margin there, and it's a real shame because Jim Graves would have been an excellent congressman. But what was surprising about that is that district, after redistricting occurred this last year, became the most conservative Republican district in the state of Minnesota. And many pundits and political operatives really wrote that off. And probably at their own peril, I think had folks in Washington and other folks been paying more attention to what was going on there, we potentially could have really run the table here in Minnesota and pulled off probably one of the biggest upsets in the country.
Well, it seems it was no easy feat for Jim Graves to come as close as he did when you consider Michelle Bachmann's fundraising prowess. I think it was in the 2010 cycle that didn't she raise the most money of any congressional candidate
in the
country?
And she spent about $13 million on a congressional race in 2010, which is unheard of for congressional races, as you know. And she spent quite a bit this time and outspent Jim by, I think, a 2 or 3 to 1 margin. The reality was, though, that what was going on in that district, and it was really the undercurrent, is there was a lot of Republicans who just couldn't bring themselves to vote for Michelle Bachmann. Her run for the presidency over the last year and a half really alienated her from the voters in the 6th District. And I think not only the fact that she ignored the 6th District as she was running for president, but some of her crazy statements and antics really just, I think, were the final straw for many of those voters in the 6th District. And, I think it's a wake-up call for Congresswoman Bachmann. She's going to have to pay a lot of attention to people in her district and rebuild those bridges in the coming years. But that is a tough district for us. It will be tough for us to win.
Let's talk, too, for a second about the impact of the 2 constitutional amendments that appeared on the Minnesota ballot, both of which were defeated, as we mentioned earlier. Michael Broadcorp, the former Senate staffer up in the state legislature, had given an interview last fall where he admitted something that many of us suspected was true from the beginning, that the Republican-controlled legislature in 2012 put both of these questions on the ballot, both the voter ID and the marriage definition amendments on the ballot, because they believed that it would mobilize the conservative base and also turn independents out to vote for their candidates. But that strategy seems to have backfired. How big a factor were the two constitutional amendments in the overall Democratic victories?
They were a big factor, but in the end, in terms of the legislative majorities, those races were decided by the candidates and the issues themselves. But let me tell you how it played into our victory. Our Achilles heel coming out of the 2010 election. In 2010, we had record low turnout amongst Democrats. We had 94,000 fewer Democrats voting in 10 compared to 2006. We dipped below the 2006 midterm, and because of that, we lost close races up and down the ticket here in Minnesota in 2010.
Including right here in Egan
right
and
here
Burnsville.
in Egan.
Right.
And they were all, right on the margins. But the reality is that as we went into 2012, our standard bearers here in Minnesota were really running races that were unopposed. Senator Klobuchar, in a way, having such a large lead, no one ever felt that her race was in jeopardy. So in terms of her generating the type of enthusiasm and excitement with her campaign, as well as President Obama here, and they ultimately did. But my point is that what we needed going into the 2012 election was a shot in the arm as Democrats. We needed an issue or a candidate or a campaign that could galvanize our base. And that's what those issues did. Both of those amendments galvanized our base to action. So anyone who was thinking, well, maybe President Obama and Senator Klobuchar don't need my vote, of course they were going to get out and go to the polls.
This became a reason for people
Correct.
to come out, maybe particularly young voters too. Wasn't there a lot of speculation that before this election that young voters were perhaps a little bit lethargic and disillusioned, that maybe the Obama administration hadn't performed to their expectations? But young people, it turns out, they did turn out.
Yeah, and I think there was some of that, but I don't believe that. And in fact, I think what you saw happen here is the amendment campaigns really galvanized people in terms of their turnout. But at the end of the day, Senator Klobuchar ran a very aggressive, robust field effort to turn people out as well. So did President Obama, one of the largest presidential campaigns we've had here in quite some time, and a lot of effort, boots on the ground, reaching out into communities of color, reaching out into other historically underrepresented communities. All of that's why I say it's a perfect storm. You can't, as some would like to say, give credit just to the marriage amendment.
Right.
All of it came together in a way that made sure that any Achilles heel or weakness we had as a party didn't occur in that election.
Let's delve a little further into the mechanics of politics, if you will, because you and I have both worked on a lot of campaigns. You were heading up an effort in 2010 called Win 2010. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately for your Democratic candidates, we didn't win. And there used to be a time in Minnesota politics, I think I'm a little bit older than you, and I remember this, where if the DFL prevailed in Minnesota, it was because you came out with big margins in the core cities of Minneapolis, St. Paul, Duluth, and the Range. But those days have changed, demographics in Minnesota have changed. And now what we've seen in recent years, Democrats lost control of the legislature in 2010 because they lost a lot of seats in suburban districts, in swing districts. But this year, they won back many of those same seats that they lost.
Yep.
So talk a little bit about what some of the groundwork was. I know the Obama campaign had a field operation in Minnesota for over a year before the election. What was some of the groundwork in terms of identifying what it was that voters were concerned about?
Yeah, one of the things, we run what's called a coordinated campaign, the UDF, the United Democratic Fund. We bring all of our electoral partners around one table to focus on one plan of how we ID, persuade, and turn out our supporters and our base. The reality is, one of the things we did differently from years past, based on the 2010 election results, is we started conversations with our base much earlier. See, the mistake we made in 2010 is we assumed that Democrats were going to vote with us, so we didn't need to talk to them. We didn't need to encourage them to vote until those final 2 weeks. And the reality is that there were a lot of people who were upset and frustrated in 2010 at the Democratic Party majority are base voters who needed to have that conversation.
Who didn't come out.
And they didn't because we didn't ask them to. And so what we did this year is we made a very conscious decision to start those conversations with the base voters much earlier than we have in the past. And we ran one of the largest get out the vote operations we've ever run. Having in the final 2 days, we had over 1 million plus contacts on the Monday and Sunday before the election. We had 15,000 volunteers out on the streets on Election Day, which is far more than we've ever had before. And so there were a lot of effort made into making sure that we had a very robust turnout. We knew, given what happened in 10, that we lost the majorities on such a slim margin that if we increased the turnout, we would win back those legislative majorities. And so clearly increasing the turnout meant we needed strong candidates at the top of the ticket like Senator Klobuchar, President Obama. We needed to have an issue or a candidate that could galvanize our base and make sure that they turn out. And then we needed to make sure that we had the biggest and most expansive get out the vote operation we've ever had. And we did that.
I know Jim Carlson, who was successful in reclaiming his Senate seat here in Eagan, defeated incumbent Republican Senator Ted Daley, and also our House candidates, first-timer Lori Halverson, who won in 51B, and Sandy Mason, who returned to her former seat in the House. When they were out campaigning this summer and this fall, and I know I saw this firsthand, they were also registering new voters. How big an impact did new voter registration have on the outcome of the 2012 election?
Well, it did. And, you know, we're fortunate here in Minnesota that we have a same-day registration system that allows people to register day of.
Even though it was under assault.
It was under assault, correct.
The majority in the legislature last year.
Right. But one of the things, we have a proud tradition. Every cycle we lead the nation in voter turnout, and we did again this past cycle. But voter registration is critical for the future because we need to grow the electorate. It's not enough to just continue to get your share of the registered voters, right? About a third are Democrats, a third Republicans, and a third are independent. To win in places like Eagan, you can't just win with Democrats. You need to be able to get Republican voters and some independent voters, but you also need to find those voters that aren't registered and get them registered to the vote and hopefully persuade them to support your candidacy. Voter registration is an absolutely critical part moving forward. And one of the things that I think the Republicans haven't learned is that you can't win elections if you are a shrinking party that's only trying to appeal to a very narrow sliver of the electorate.
Right. You were quoted in the newspaper recently, I believe as Burnsville Sun quoted you as saying that the Democratic Farmer Labor Party in 2012 was a big tent party.
Correct.
That you constructed a party that appeals to a broad, diverse coalition of people. And what is your sense of how the Republicans how they missed out on this opportunity?
You know, when you look at what happened around the country with all the exit polls that were done around the presidential race, Mitt Romney and the Republican Party, it's like they're nostalgic, like they want to go back to the 1950s, 1940s. The reality is our country has changed. We have very sizable, growing populations of Latino voters. Here in this state, Somali voters, Hmong voters, Native American voters. And it's not enough to just put up a token attempt to develop those relationships in the election year, as the Republicans try to do. You have to have a long-term dialogue and conversation with people in those communities. And most importantly, your policies have to match up with their values as a community. And I think that's where the DFL and Democrats generally have worked hard to develop those relationships, because we are a big tent party. We believe that the greatness of our country is that we are a melting pot, that what makes us great is our diversity, and we need to celebrate that.
Well, the DFL's roots, Hubert Humphrey, when the party was created in 1944, it was pulling together urban Democrats and rural farmers, the farmer labor portion of the Democratic Farmer Labor Party.
Right.
So very interesting. Well, let me ask you this, Ken. So we now have Democrats prevailing from the top to the bottom of the ticket in Minnesota. We have a Democratic governor who will be up for re-election in 2014. We have a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate in our state legislature. What are Democrats going to do with this new majority? What can Minnesotans expect to see?
Well, let me repeat a conversation I had with the governor and our legislative leaders 2 days after the election. As people are, going around the room patting themselves on the back, I said, let's remember one thing. I'm interested in building a permanent majority so we can do good things in the state for the long term. And that means, on the one hand, we shouldn't overreach. But, and that's becomes a little bit of a cliche word these days, not overreaching. The real referendum in this past election was on inaction, gridlock, partisanship, shutdown. That's what voters are voting against. So if Democrats go up to the legislature here in St. Paul or in Congress in Washington and do the same thing, that they are so paralyzed by overreaching that they underperform, we're going to lose in 2014. What we have to do is very simple. We have to do good things for the people of Minnesota. And if we do that, if we start delivering on those things that we promised,
they'll keep
investments
their
in education,
right.
Investments in our roads and bridges, jobs, getting a serious tax reform in this state once and for all, and solving our budget deficit. In Washington, making sure that we are doing everything we can to protect middle-class families here in Minnesota and around the country. If we focus on those things, those bread and butter issues, we will win again in 2014.
Property tax relief?
Property tax relief is a big part of that. I mean, there's a whole
local government aid, which even though Egan doesn't receive LGA, a lot of communities in Minnesota have needed it, and they've seen it slashed because of the budget situation in recent years. Do you see the governor and legislature addressing LGA?
Yeah, I think what the governor is going to look at is a budget that is fair and responsible, and then also a budget that, as I mentioned, once and for all, focuses in on returning Minnesota to being a great state. See, so many times we get focused in on the means and not the end result. And what I'm reminding DFLers and others is that, yes, we need to fight for revenue, and we need to go out there and get some tax reform that's fair and equitable, and we need a balanced approach to this budget deficit we have. But for what end? The reason we're doing this is so we can make Minnesota a better place, make Minnesota better in terms of our schools, in terms of our roads, in terms of jobs, in terms of all those things that make Minnesota great. If we can focus on that piece, the investments that are needed, I think DFLers will continue to win in 2014.
One of the real missed opportunities during the bonding session of the legislature, of course, was that the legislature slashed Governor Dayton's request, which had money, millions of dollars for shovel-ready jobs, not make-work jobs, but infrastructure repair and improvements for Minnesota that would have put people back to work. And so can we set the stage with unified control between the governor's office and the legislature so that we can now move forward on these things? You say yes.
I think so. And, I think, both the Speaker-elect Thiessen and Majority Leader-elect Bach and I and the governor and others have had a lot of conversations about how we work together. That doesn't mean there's not going to be disagreement in the details. But I think Democrats can agree on a sort of broad stroke philosophy of how we want to move the state forward, and then figure out the details through the process that exists through the legislative process. There will certainly be disagreements. We've been in this situation before where we've had DFL control of the legislature and the governor, and it's not to say that things just happened the way everyone expected them to.
And I can tell you from having worked in Congress a lot of years, I saw firsthand my years in Washington that just having a president and a Congress of the same party doesn't always mean that everyone agrees.
Right.
People have different priorities and different agendas too.
Yep.
Let me ask you about the gay marriage issue, because as we talked about earlier, the amendment that was going to limit the definition of marriage was defeated in Minnesota, which surprised a lot of people, frankly. Do you believe that the Minnesota legislature this session will pass a bill legalizing gay marriage in Minnesota?
My hope is that that we will start the discussion, continue the conversation this legislative session. I served on the board of Minnesotans United for All Families. I was very actively involved in that campaign, and it's a very personal issue to me. For Minnesotans and for others, I hope that the legislature does take it up this year. However, given that the Supreme Court is going to be ruling on this in June, I do do think that it takes some of the impetus off of legislators to have to potentially take a really tough vote. That said, we do need to have the conversation. I believe that there is room for that conversation in the 2013 legislative session. Whether or not we pass a bill, the conversation needs to start, and we need to start figuring out how we can work towards full marriage equality in the state. And I do think we'll get there. It may not be in 13, but it will happen. And the first step was defeating that amendment.
So you've recently announced, Ken, that you intend to run for second term as party chair of the state DFL. What is it that you hope to accomplish in a second term that has been elusive or not, that you haven't been able to accomplish in your first term as party chair?
Yeah, it's a great question. Let me start, though, by saying that when the governor asked me to run for chair 2 years ago, he made me promise him that I would see him through his re-election. So
you're fulfilling a commitment to Governor Dayton.
But I do intend to run again, as you mentioned. Obviously, the first 2 years of my time as chair was spent on getting our fiscal house in order. I inherited a lot of debt, getting the party back on a strong financial position where we could be relevant in elections.
Let's talk about that a moment. I believe I saw a figure that the party was in about $730,000 of debt.
$725, yeah.
And now you're in the black right now?
We're in the black going into next year.
I don't expect you to give specific numbers that the opposition can necessarily hear about, but do you feel good about the party's finances on a longer term
obviously
basis?
When you compare the parties, it's a little unfair given the fact that the Republicans have $1.5 million in debt and are in complete disarray, still fighting the civil war within their party. But our party is in one of the strongest financial positions it's ever been in. So when you combine that with our electoral wins this last fall, we're really truly in one of the best positions the DFL party's ever been in its history. And so, in terms of what I want to accomplish in the next 2 years, I want to make sure as we head into the midterm, as you know, the second midterm of a president is usually the most brutal for the party in power. And you couple that with the fact that we have two guys who are running who won by recount, it could be a very tough year for the DFL. So for me, we're using every single day from now until 2014 elections to organize, to build the foundation for success. And, we're not going to take anything for granted. I think Senator Franken and Governor Dayton will win, and I think we will hold the House of Representatives. But it's not going to be without a lot of hard work and really sophisticated energy.
We're down to our last minute and a half.
Yeah.
These interviews always go too quickly. But I have to ask you this. I know you're the chair of the DFL party, not the other party. Do you believe, what is your sense of what lessons Republicans have drawn from 2012, and do you see them coming back into a, shall we say, a more competitive position in 2014?
I hope so. And in fact, I had this conversation with a Republican friend of mine, encouraging them not to leave the party, but to stay and try to rebuild it. Because for democracy's sake, and frankly for the DFL party's sake, it's always good to have a healthy party on the other side, just from a dialogue standpoint. But the reality is, at the end of the day, I don't think they have learned the lessons of the 2012 election, particularly when it comes to expanding their messaging to appeal to a broader segment of the electorate, particularly when it comes to some of the tax reform proposals that have been put on the table.
Well, it's going to be very interesting to see how this turns out. Ken Martin, a difficult job to be chair of the DFL, a challenging job. Always have to be on your toes, I'm quite sure. But congratulations on your party's victories in November, and we look forward to seeing what gets accomplished in this new year.
Thank you,
Ken
Steve.
Martin, chair of the DFL, thank you for being on Access to Democracy.
Thank you.